Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to now start One Health International Forum 2022 Subcommittee on Environmental Initiatives from Kyoto Prefecture University, Department of Japanese Food Culture. Professor Hein Murray would chair the session. Please take the floor. Thank you. Yes, Mare is my name from Kyoto Prefecture University. This is the Environmental Initiatives Subcommittee. I am going to serve as a chair or facilitator, and we would like to have some 30 minutes or so of discussion this morning. First of all, from the National Institute for Environmental Studies, in charge of biological biodiversity, we have Dr. Koichi Goka on the topic of significance of conservation of biodiversity for risk management of emerging infectious diseases. Dr. Goka, please take the floor. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. You can take slides, but no SNS posting, please. And this is my title slide. And biological diversity. Sorry for the funny slide. If you have seen the photo of mine, I am known as an archaeologist. And I often appear on TV, but that's not my full-time job. I am a full-time researcher at the National Institute for Environmental Studies for global warmings and PM 2.5 and biodiversities and so on. And biodiversity conservation is the research team I'm leading, and the biological diversity risk assessment office is the team I'm leading, as you can see. Biological diversity related risks are being assessed by my project team members. First of all, I would like to start with what is biodiversity? Perhaps you know the word, but what does it mean? Perhaps it is not well digested in the community at large. So this is what I would like to explain. This is a very complex concept. And what you know mostly as a biodiversity is a species biodiversity, but it's not limited there. Genetic biodiversity is where all the diversity matters start, and then lead to species biodiversities and the ecosystem biodiversities for forests, woods, rivers, and so on. Then on the earth, there are so much landscape biodiversities, and it will be locally specific matters sometimes, and living creatures are within this broad scope of biodiversity on the earth. And we have to address this as part of the national policies and the earth policies as well. Why is this very important? The earth has its specific and unique biodiverse system, and that's we can enjoy beautiful water, beautiful air, beautiful scenery, and so on. And this is the biosphere that we are living in, and we are part of the biosphere. And air, food, and water is what we need, as well as the other living creatures. And the biodiversity is a supporting pillar of our livelihood and the livelihood for the other living creatures. And we missed so much traveling abroad during the COVID lockdown. Why do we like to travel? We would like to be exposed to other elements of the cultures and societies. So that is the enrichment in the human societies, but this is also well rooted to the biological diversities as well. And why is this important? For social, cultural development, we are based on biological diversities. Its conservation is not nature-loving activities, but whether you like the nature or not, or living creatures or not, we have to live together with the other living creatures for the safe and secure and rich society. So biological diversities is what we have to respect, because not that we love ecosystem, but rather our egoistic activities needs it. And it is locally specific, and its characteristics based upon the local elements. But it is degraded very rapidly, and the habitat destruction, pollution, and invasive foreign species arrivals, and the climate changes. So the environment is changing so rapidly. We are not adapting well, and we are perhaps a part of the destructive environment, so to speak. One of the elements is the emerging infectious diseases. This is the Ministry of Health job, or Ministry of Infectious Disease Institute job, but we cannot leave it to them. We are part of the research communities to address that. For example, this is a frog-specific fungi disease. In 1980s, it started to spread to a lot of wild amphibious species, and this is fungus. And this is a strange fungi living on the skin surface of the frogs or amphibians. And its spread was so scary that a lot of frogs started to die across the world. And it landed into Japan through pet frogs. And it was a panicking situation. And the Ministry of Health took initiative, and we started the research. And we swabbed the infected frogs, and we started to fungi DNA samples throughout the world, not only limited to Japan. Then we got lineage analysis like this. As a result of this research effort, we learned a lot. For example, this is the South American ones, and blue is the Chinese one, and yellow is the South African one, and white is North American, the European ones. A lot of haplotypes. So they have a lot of DNA type, and they are developing throughout the world. What is the haplotype we found in Japan? We got them all, the global ones. So we are the highly diverse haplotype in Japan, but the host and the fungi root research. The salamander, giant salamander of Japan, was the root of all this fungi. And 1902, this is an old salamander sample in Japan, and we detected the fungi here. And also the red ones, throughout the world, they are the wort endogenic to Okinawa. But as you can see, this is another amphibian, and this is a root animal for that. And sometimes they are not infectious to those fungi. So we were exporting that throughout the world for a relatively long period of time. So it is a Japan origin hypothesis emerged. When this was announced, researchers were shocked, and the Japanese press was not impressed, because the Japanese animals are not dying because it was of Japanese origin. But I was happy to learn that the research gave some percussion in the community. What about the Ushigairu frog, the large one? This was imported from America for food purpose, and they live in the rivers close to the human activities, but they traveled well into inlands for part of the ecotourism and so on. It's a kind of strange tourism, but they go through developed roadways for the sake of ecotourism, and the fungi and other invasive creatures reached inland, deep in the country. And this frog fungi research gave us a lot of findings. It's a symbiosis, and we got the co-evolution. And part of the human activities helped them to spread throughout the world. So this is the same pandemic mechanism and the infectious disease risk management relevant to the COVID-19 as well. So we have to be involved.
これから発展させ
So we really have to deepen the understanding of the infectious diseases and the ecosystems. So having said that, when it comes to pathogens, part of it is the virus. They evolved together with wildlife. So this was around way before the humans were around. So as part of the biodiversity, they have evolved. So they are serving a very important function in the ecosystem as a whole. What that means is if one of these species has gone up too much and is to destroy the balance of the ecosystem, then the virus would take on and would destroy them. And so they would work as natural enemies. So they would start with the zebra, for instance, and zebra. Among the zebra, some of the ones that can run fast would evolve. So the virus, in a way, is serving as a lion, eliminating the slow ones. So you have to think of the virus with the pathogens. When it comes to practical issues, the rainforests are a treasure of wildlife and also treasure of viruses. And there are all sorts of viruses evolving, and we are destroying those places, depriving them of the habitat and viruses. And in the end, virus is to come into the human world, to urban societies from the jungle as they moved their habitat, and they have become the emergent infectious diseases. In the 1970s, there's SARS virus, Ebola, hemorrhage fever, and what is the cause of AIDS, HIV. They used to live quietly, but because humans destroyed their habitats, they have come into the human world. So that's already indicated. So this was published in 2020. The data behind an article. Individual circle indicates the kind of animal, and the size of the dot indicates the number of viruses, and the lines connecting the dots can show the transmission possibilities. And there are huge circles with blue, meaning animals that have lots of viruses. And if you look at the breakdown, these are all livestock kept by humans, and they have the infectious diseases, viruses. And what is connected with the livestock, the wildlife could be the source of food or ungulate animals, etc. And so within the bodies of these livestock, the viruses evolve and become emerging infectious diseases. And as for bats and the primates, they have the pathogens that can be transmitted into humans. And also there are endangered species where the populations are declining. They tend to have a high percentage of viruses. So if you handle such species, we need to be very careful as they handle them. So this is the cutting edge of the emerging infectious diseases, and that's lead to COVID-19. So about 3 years ago around this time, in Wuhan, there was a strange disease that emerged in the market. Nobody expected that this would spread in the world in about a month. This rapidly spread and had showed the adaptability and the infectiousness, and the number of the patients has topped 600 million, and more than 6.5 million people have died. These are said to have come from the wildlife in the southern part or Southeast Asia. Civets and the bats are said to have had the virus, and the mutation of that virus has turned into COVID-19. These COVID viruses were in the hotspots in the depths of China, where there was abundant wildlife, and some of them evolved in the bodies and have come into existence or contact with the humans. And this Wuhan was one of the centers of the global supply chain, and so that has caused to spread to the rest of the world. So humans coming close to the animals, and with the globalization, this has spread to the rest of the world. And because of this, the absolute number of viruses has remained high and has led to the mutations. So that means meta-population structure was maintained. So there's continuous evolution, and virus will never die out. So far from Wuhan type, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, it has evolved into something that is highly infectious, and now BA1, Omicron, BA1, BA2, BA5. This has continued the evolution and continue to stay on the earth. It means the number of people that are infected is not going down, and therefore the virus can evolve continuously. Now it's down to BA5, but every time there's an outbreak, or in winter there was BA2, and then starting in fall, BA5. So every time there's a new outbreak, the virus continues to evolve and will go up. And currently BQ1 is spreading in western parts of the world, and XBB seems to be still evolving in Southeast Asia. There's no telling how virulent they can be. And also with alpha, beta, delta, gamma, what happened to them? They are now living inside the bodies of animals. What we found out in February this year is that one that has evolved in a deer in Canada has been detected. It seems like from Japan to deer is now spilling back into the human. So the virus can evolve in the body of the wildlife, and so this will be a huge issue where it can come back into the human world. So COVID-19 virus, it seems like we're acting as though this never happened, but because of the social structure, we will always have to watch out for the next new infectious diseases. There's monkeypox that is being talked about, but the genome is evolving from 2020s. It has already gone into European countries from Africa, and now it's evolving at a rapid pace. This is similar to COVID-19. What was epidemic has gone into Western societies and has accelerated the pace of evolution. So from epidemic to pandemic, that shift has already occurred, and the absolute volume will be going up, and that will facilitate the evolution. So we should curb or control, as it is still relatively low in number. And there's avian influenza as well that is going around, and we need to be careful about that. The Spanish flu is the result of this spread of this avian flu. As a acarologist, I'd like to draw your attention to this this virus, SFTS. This has been spreading from 2012. For some reason, it's spreading mainly in the western part of Japan, has high mortality rate, so this requires caution. This tick was sucking on the blood of the wildlife. Now, why is it in a human society? That's because wildlife, the deer, bears, and such are coming into the human community. They come with the ticks, and the ticks would be brought by raccoon, which is a foreign invasive species. The SFTS positivity rate among raccoons is very high, so it seems like raccoons are spreading ticks. So those will infect the pets in town, and then that would lead to human beings. So the disease that was in the depths of the mountain is now very much transmitted to human society. So there's a huge change that is taking place in terms of relationships with wildlife and humans. So the ticks can really increase out of control in the human society. So this kind of pathogen can attack the human world, but this virus attack is something that is happening due to the natural law, as it were, because as you would see often in the textbook of ecosystem, there is a food chain, and there's external energy of solar power, and then that will be consumed by the fungi and then plants, and then the herbivores and carnivores. So, and then all these animals would, when they die, they will be decomposed by the microbes, and so there's a cycle of living organisms and creatures. And the important rule is that as you go up the food chain, there is a fewer number of species, so there's a stable shape of pyramid. That's been the system. But as the human beings comes into the picture, there's 8 billion of humans at the very top of the food chain. So they need to eat. So from the very bottom, all sorts of resources are being developed and are exploited. What that means is that the habitat and what they can eat in the latter bottom or latter part of the food chain will have less. So there will be less resources for human beings. So what they did next is to dig out the fossil fuel as the source of energy. It's in the history of 4 billion years of evolution of animals, no other species has done that. So the ability to absorb such impact is not evolving. So there are huge amounts of wastes being generated that cannot be absorbed, and also there's a huge amount of energy being absorbed, and the CO2 being emitted cannot be absorbed by the Earth's ecosystem anymore, leading to global warming. So at the very root of the global warming is that a huge biomass of human beings are consuming huge amounts of resources. That's the very root of the problem. And once that happens, it would lose the sustainability, but the ecosystems are not remaining quietly. There's resilience function.
ものがいるならこれは
If we are going to have such a dense predator, then what should we do? We got to revenge this, and their tool or the MO is the COVID-like pandemics. We do have a lot of energy reserves and so on. It's a good attack target, rich attack target. By reducing humans by number, perhaps they may preserve the Earth. It is true that for our time being, during the COVID lockdown, Beijing had a blue sky, and the Hawaiian Ocean got a beautiful coral reef back. So COVID was a savior, in a sense, to the planet living creatures. So the biodiversity is the strongest, but human greed is, again, strongest as well. In the neighboring Fukuoka Dome, Kuwata Keisuke is a popular singer, attracted to so many fans. So we are not, giving up our, popular cultures and so on. But you see, destruction of the biodiversity has to be stopped, and we have to move for the harmony with nature. That is our safety and security. So the right way of symbiosis is quite important. It is quite important to have a proper zoning. What do we mean? The habitat and resources distribution has to be well balanced between humans and other living creatures. That's for the symbiosis of the society and the Earth. And we have to leave the exploitative development, and we have to have a paradigm shift to localization and sustainable economy. So we should produce locally, we should consume locally. That's not the vegetable growers' words. It applies to the resources at large, for example, other energy resources, and so local recirculation of the reusable energy is what I mean, and as well as the other resources. So locally based sustainable society would be a safer and a securer community for us, and it will lead to the much healthier global economy and global society. And lastly, I would like to say that I am an archaeologist all the way through. Ticks this is the stag beetle mites. When you keep those stag beetles, it's not the guagata debris or tears, but rather it's parasites, and they live on the stag beetles. I love them all. So cute, indeed. But these mites has a variety of hosts. They are all part of the stag beetle species subtypes and so on. And I took special interest in them, the mites. And this is what I got as a lineage, DNA lineage. As you can see, polyphyletic patterns. And they have a grand history of their own, despite of their size. And the host and mite correlationship, it's one-on-one, so to speak. So they do have their special stag beetle to live with. That's the pattern of co-evolution, so to speak. And they had this 12 million years of history behind. And this is the CG graphics. This is my hobby, indeed, my drawing. And I'm proud to show this graphic of this mite. Archaeologist, artist, I am. And this is going to be the original copy of a commemorative postage stamp in US. I'm so proud. And the picture shows our retired emperor and empress visiting my research lab. And I did not wear sunglasses on that day, but I got CGs of those mite pictures and drawings, and the empress asked what this is. And I was so proud to go over this for 10 minutes. And I impressed the former emperor and empress so much, and they took the artwork to their residence. So I'm so proud that this is a great contribution to the imperial household as well. And of course, this is one of my latest book, and they have their own food, habitat and so on. And I hope COVID world would come to an quiet end and so on. But thank you very much for your attention.
小川先生ありがとうございました。ダニが可愛いということはあまり考えたことはなかったんですけど、言われてみればまあ可愛い。
Thank you very much, Dr. Goka. I never thought of mites and ticks as being cute, but I guess they can be. So, I was able to learn a lot about the world of the ticks. Next is Professor Chiho Watanabe, who is the professor and executive advisor to President School of Tropical Medicine and Global Health at Nagasaki University. Her presentation is entitled Way Forward to Planetary Health. If you're ready, Professor Watanabe, the floor is yours.
皆さんおはようございます。
Good morning, everyone. My name is Watanabe. So, following Professor Goka's roller coaster presentation, I will speak at a slower pace. So my presentation is entitled Way Forward to Planetary Health. You might see some advertisement later on, but University of Nagasaki is where I work at, and this is like a one school that focuses on planetary health, and we started that in October. I think there aren't that many departments around the world where the title planetary health is attached to the name of the department. So if you could please.
本日の話の流れとしては、人申請という。
Today, you may probably have heard the word anthropocentrism, and I just would like to talk about how that came about. So, and planetary health is one of the status, and I would like to just talk about how to get to that position. So, the prescription to a pathogen. What is the planetary health? I don't think I need to go into the details of explanation, but there are various issues we have. There is climate change, ocean plastic issues. And if you look around the world, air pollution is a serious concern. Several millions of people are dying every year from that. And also collapse of biosphere and ecology. And there was a great explanation in the previous session. And of course, we have a pandemic. And along with the ecosystem, the food is another concern. There is a growing number of starving population, and the number has not really changed from the time that I learned back in when I became a student. So, of course, with the large number with the population growth, there is no trend in the decrease of starving population. Now, why are we here? Why did we get to this point? So this is a study in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment UN project held in 2002 to 2005. So, when you look at 20th century, I think human did very well. This is from, so if you look at the images of the figures from the developed countries, you can actually see how we have really became more active. And in 20th century, European countries probably producing like double. Our activity has doubled. And of course, Japan has also had like fourfold growth. And if you look at GDP growth, I don't think this is the best index to measure our activity, but this is one of the way to look at the economic activities. But so Dr. Kofiaram was asking, humans looks good, but what about nature? So we had a review, and we had various findings. And as you can see here, the water issue, land issue, and water resources. And we are consuming large amount of the nature. And we are polling our society and economic activities and prosperities. So, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, our prosperity really relied on, was at the cost of nature. So now the magnitude of human activity is rivaling that of the global nature. And that has been a discussion that was in various topics for these 2 days. And we all thought humans are much smaller than the Earth, but it's not like that. Our activity is rivaling that of nature. So now that's why we are talking about Anthropocene. That's the way to describe our activity, or how we are actually rivaling the nature, how the human's activity is getting larger than what the nature can hold. So this is another way of looking at the same thing. So we have all those dots. The dots symbolize each country. And this is at the beginning of the 21st century. And if you go toward the right, it's more prosperous. And if you are higher up, you are putting more impact on the nature. So that means healthy and as prosperous a human society is established at the expense of the environment. And this is actually per population. So individuals are putting a lot of impact and burden on the nature. And what is happening as a result of that, this is one of the take-home messages I'd like you to understand, planetary boundaries. So we are becoming more aware of those different signs. Back in 2009, the Sweden research group presented this. So we talked about climate change. We've been talking about climate change, and we also are concerned about biosphere integrity. But there is other concerns like land usage, freshwater usage, and biochemical flow. This is maybe a word that you are very familiar with, but it's a flow of like nitrogen and atmospheric aerosol, and ozone depletion. And we also have novel substances. There are various chemical substances that are new. And it is actually threatening the health of the earth. And at the end, it's going to interfere or threaten humankind as well. So we have to be aware of this in order to really understand where we are going. And this is a very important concept for our study. And it's been updated back in 2015. And probably this year or next year, there is going to be another update. And what is important is, of course, we've been looking at the climate change and biosphere integrity. These are the two main concerns. And there are 7 other concerns. And those are derivatives of the two, the climate change and biosphere integrity. Now let's go back to Anthropocene discussion. This Dr. Paul Crutzen is the person who came up with this. He actually had won a Nobel Prize in chemistry by studying ozone hole. And so, we should actually call it as a Anthropocene back in 2000. So it's a new mark in stratum. And this is in order of 10,000 years. And we can see how the temperature has changed. And if you go back 100,000 years, you can see how it goes up and down. But if you go toward the right, from like 10 to 0, they're closer to us. In the last 10,000 years, the temperature of the Earth has been quite stable. And we call it Holocene. So what happened 10,000 years ago? That's when we started cultivating. The humankind actually started cultivation. Before that, we were actually hunting for our food. So we started growing plants. And that was actually supported by the very stable temperature and weather. And that's how the humankind's activity actually started flourishing. But if you look at the past 100 years or so, this stable stage is ending, and we are seeing climate change. We have giant typhoon, floods. So, we've enjoyed a very stable nature and the climate of the Earth. And I think we are exiting Holocene, and now we are going into Anthropocene. So that's how we are positioning. And you have Rockstrom, Dr. Rockstrom. He's the He's a leader in the climate change studies. And if you look back, Holocene era was really good. Do we really want to come out of that and enter a new era? If you are not doing if you don't act, by 2070 there will be various things. The human niche will be really shrinking considerably. And we are looking at average temperature. It's going to get close to 30s. And once it gets to 30s, it's going to get very difficult for humans to survive. And the annual temperature, the means is about, it's sub-Saharan temperature. That's like 0.8% of the globe. But actually, it's going to grow to larger area. Southern Asia, north of Australia, and South America, all in that will fall under that higher temperature climate. Like 20% of the land is going to experience over 30 degrees in average annual temperature.
So having that said, in the second half of 20th century, we kind of subdued environment, oppressed environment. Now it's coming back to us. Environmental burden should be lessened, and that has been well practiced with underdeveloped societies, but we have to shift to the other, let's say, environmental burden treatment, so to speak, as a developed nation. Or we have to change our lifestyle as well. And for the developing countries, we have to offer way and support their way to have their own development without much stress to the environment. And what can we do with this environment? SDGs is one of the approach for sustainable development. 17 goals has been upheld, and the green circles, 4 of them are for environmental protection, and the rest are for the human community and civilization and economies. And as you can see, in the second half of the 20th century, it was not well balanced. That's why the 16, 17 goals has to be integrated and address it together. 1, 9, 10, or the 1 and 3 are being targeted and so on. But by practicing that as a part, you have to do not partially, but you have to do all of them at once. SDGs goes back to the comprehensive concept approach, but in reality, in practice, integrated or comprehensive approach has not been practiced well. So SDGs is one of the prescription to correct the Anthropocene problems, but I think its presentation was not well done. I would say this is the SDG wedding cake to present the structures. Johan Rockström and his group did so in 3 layers. The biosphere protection, society protection, and economy protection. 3 layers approach. At the bottom goals support the top 2 layers as well. For example, the bottom goals, that is for the sustainability of Earth health. Like I said, the 9 crises that I've planetary boundaries mentioned, they address the bottom layer issues. But planetary boundaries is quite important. But within that boundaries, can we protect our properties and lives? Not so. Because for the climate change, they say that we are not beyond a crisis level, but I think we do see so much harms and damages done by extreme phenomena. Without accomplishing the bottom goals, we cannot accomplish the layers above. But layer structure sometimes do not address the issue best. Sometimes you have to have a comprehensive approach. For example, global health. In this context, several projects are being proposed, but I don't think they address the bottom layers well enough. But they address issues closer to our livelihood and community, and they sometimes treat them differently or separately. That has been done in the past. One of the example is, I have to make this simple because of the time constraint. One of the SDGs goal, when you pursue one, what happened to the others? And National Environmental Studies Institute did this particular study. And as you can see, PDV, trade-off, and one goals and so on must address this. The A, co-benefit, B, trade-off. So co-benefit is a win-win situation. B, trade-off is when you have one, you do not have the other, and so on. So there are various combinations as such. It's not the all win-win situation. That means all goals has to be monitored carefully and balanced carefully. So, having that said, SDGs. One of the constructors of the concept, Kanye, Dr. Kanye of Keio University, addressed this. Comprehensive approach is quite important. Another, SDGs goals. They present them as goals. It's a finishing point, it seems, like the game over or something like that. But it's not the case. Let's say 2030 SDGs goals are being set and so on. But accomplishing the goals, and can we sustain the state that the goal has accomplished? The goal seems to be static. You stop there or something like that. But we have to be in a dynamic framework. Dynamic status is what we have to accomplish. So having that said, planetary health is another concept on top of it. And it's not back to SDG. The planetary health was developed in parallel to that. They are closely associated. Planetary health was first voiced in 2015, 7 years ago. Lancet, a very famous medical journal, well-respected journal, accomplished this particular concept and was published. And 20 experts got 1 year-long committee deliberation and produced this planetary health paper. What does this address? For the sustainability, based upon the existing frameworks and ideas, they propose something new. That's how they do. The existing framework includes planetary boundaries concept as well as SDGs. In fact, they were moving in parallel. Deliberations were done in parallel, so to speak. And also environmental health. This is an old classic research field as well, and they built a lot of findings and expertise. And planetary health based upon all those. And so what does it mean? The 3 rings, top layer, middle layer, bottom layer, and association of those elements were being studied so that all goals be sustainable in a way that we proceed forward. So, like I said, planetary health would have association and relationship to have a comprehensive mutual approach. It's easier to be said than done. Very challenging because there would be multiple hundreds of combinations to implement that. But puzzling this and playing with this concept helps us to address the issues in more holistic way, I would say. Let me also mention that the planetary health, it's a health status of the Earth. But it's a misleading phrase sometimes. This is for the Earth health plus human health combined together. And Earth health means Earth as a planet and inorganic matter and organic matter plus the ecosystem on it and in it, and the humans with our civilizations. Both are being addressed in planetary health. Both should, coexist in healthy state. So what's important is that the Earth health depends on the human health and vice versa. That's quite important to understand the interdependence. And as you can see, the human health and the Earth health, what are the associations? Who is impacting what? In the left, human activities, creating the environmental burden and stress. And this leads to environmental changes and damages to the ecosystem, and which would negatively impact the properties and health of the human beings, and directly damaging, and sometimes with a loss of biodiversity or ecosystem, properties, health, and livelihood of humans will be affected, and also the extension of the second one, indirect, invisible, or implicit impact may come to the human society as a result of the environmental disruptions. Some of them are qualitative and some of them are quantitative. Some of them are implicit and some of them are explicit. And days to come, science must explore this and have a deeper understanding.
So, climate change, what kind of impact would it have on the human health? Well, this may be a bit complex, but on the left side, the green line is the catch. The catch of the fishery in a different type of fish species, and the green is the current status. And if it's toward the left-hand side of the green line, that means we have less catch. And if it's on the right, there are more catch. And if you look at the panel on the upper, I cannot tell what kind of fish it is, but for the Erasmo Franchi, I think is the academic name, and we are actually checking how it's going to the level of the catch is going to change, and they're looking at the climate change and fish migration and how the fishery is going to be impacted in the various areas of ocean. Because of the temperature rise in the ocean, it would actually cause lower fishery harvest. What kind of impact? The reason we are studying this is because people are wondering, the local fishermen are wondering why there are less catch, and there are reasons for that, and we are trying to understand how it's going to trend in the future. And there may be some kind of fish that we might have a larger population of in certain areas. So depending on the species of fish, they are looking at where the next is, where the fish is available, at what timing, and so this is something the fishery companies are looking at, and various experts are working on it and collaborating to really learn new things about what is happening. And of course, there are other beneficial effects between earth health and human health. So cleaner energy, less greenhouse gas emission, and a cleaner housing and active movement, and the way the industry works, and how we transport. Do we walk, or do we use bikes, or do we use public transportation? All those things will have a positive impact on the earth and human health. So we should look for more items where we would have a positive impact on both ends. So we've been talking about the planetary health, and I'd like to talk about how the planetary health and One Health is related. So planetary health, or eco-health, previously known as eco-health, it's compared to public health, it is more focused on ecological status. So human health and environmental health needs to and we would be able to use that in a local area as well as a global area. And if the difference between global health and One Health is more focused on epidemics, and planetary health is wider, has a wider focus, especially about environmental conservation. So I think it's got a bit wider scope than One Health. But One Health has been reviewed by the UN. So United Nations is trying to redefine that. And so so FAO, OEI, WHO, those organizations have got together, and they've built expert committees. So actually, One Health, the UN is considering, is very close to planetary health. And if you really want to focus on the differences between the two, the One Health focus more on epidemic. So we are running out of time.
So starting 2020, we started to have much more activities going on in this particular field. And let me introduce some of them. University activities. You can see the green ones are US-based universities, the blue Australian-based universities, and the darker blue European-based universities. They are addressing a massive program facing the planetary health. And one big foundation, Wellcome Trust, is also in this. This is one of the, let's say, publicity slide. This is Nagasaki University. As you can see, this is the cross-disciplinary program in the campus. Doctor of Public Health program started at our campus. And the planetary health, yes, this is how we are going to address it on the right researchers community. We are not alone. We have to have national government, citizens, local autonomies, and corporate members. And I think I have to add the animal kingdom as well, the fauna and the flora, as well as the future generations. We have to face them as well. So with the individuals' efforts, what can we contribute? And this is the UN promotions, advocacies on this. If you Google it, you see many concrete suggestions. Even with one individual, you can start a movement, and this is going to be a big wave. In the end, the planetary health 3 pillars, other biosphere, and the Earth size are with us. We have to address them. We have to think of the next generations and the systems thinking. And before I conclude, Dr. Goka mentioned biodiversity is ego activities, not eco activities. I agree with him partly because if you would like to have a sustainable human society, we should be away from the human-centristic dogma, so to speak. And we have to pursue 2 goals with 1 means. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Watanabe. We are going to have 5 minutes break. Thank you. We are going to announce 5 minutes break. 10:05, we would resume the session again. Thank you.
先生がまだ戻られてないんですかね。始めますか。はい。はい。では、セッションの後半に移ります。次の発表者は国立環境研究所の
So we will start with the next presentation. We have here with us the Chief Senior Researcher at National Institute for Environmental Studies, Mr. Manabu Onuma. His presentation is entitled Introduction of Avian Influenza-Related Research on Wild Birds at the National Institute for Environmental Studies. Mr. Onuma, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm at National Institute for Environmental Studies. My name is Manabu Onuma. I'd like to talk about the avian influenza-related research that is conducted at the National Institute for Environmental Studies regarding wild birds. As Professor Goka and Professor Watanabe gave comprehensive presentations on planetary health and One Health, I will have a narrower field as the focus of my presentation. Within One Health, the avian influenza, how that is being handled, is something I'd like to introduce to you about. So first of all, the avian influenza virus is one kind of type A influenza, and type A influenza virus hosts are shown on this slide. So type A influenza can infect a wide variety of different animals, can infect the livestock, humans, or wildlife, wild birds. So this virus can infect all of these. As you can see, there's a wide variety of hosts. So in terms of public health, this is a very important virus, as you all very know. As you know very well, with the infection to virus, influenza can be caused among humans. So this is a very important virus in terms of public health. And here, the swine or the pig plays an important role because the natural host of type A influenza is birds, especially ducks and shorebirds. So these wild birds are the natural hosts of this virus. And this virus can be transmitted to different types of animals. And once again, the pig is playing an important role because the pig has or is infected with the human-based viruses and avian viruses. And with the new viruses within the pig, it can be transmitted to humans. So more specific examples. You probably remember this clearly. Back in 2009, there was a pandemic, H1N1 pandemic took place. And if you analyze the gene, this is derived from the pig, chicken, and from humans. And these went through what's called reassortment and has spread to humans in terms of the transmission. So, as was shown earlier on the slide, that with that system that was depicted on the slide, the new viruses were born and caused a new pandemic. One other point about this influenza virus is this is often reported in the media, and you probably know this well. It's important in terms of the animal health. Especially this is spreading rapidly globally, H5 subtype virus. The origin of that was detected in Hong Kong in 1997. Thereafter, well, before that, why this virus is highly pathogenic, the reason behind that is at the surface of the virus there's a protein called the HA, and if you look at the amino acid sequence, the sequence of that has changed. That's the biggest reason. The virus that is not highly pathogenic, the surface protein HA on the receptor on the surface of the cell, for the virus to be attached, the structure will have to be changed, and the enzyme to change that virus can be in the respiratory disease, respiratory organs or the digestive organs. But in the case of highly pathogenic virus, the surface protein changing enzyme can be distributed in different types of cells and can be widespread. So it will mutate in such a way that the virus can increase throughout the body, so would destroy the cells throughout the body, and therefore it is highly pathogenic. So in terms of animal health, the virus was detected, which is very important from that perspective, and that was detected in 1997, and thereafter it has spread its transmission to various animals, including humans. Naturally, the natural host, the wild birds, it would transmit among the wild birds, and that has caused the mass mortality among wild birds. So highly pathogenic avian influenza virus causing mass mortality, and this is examples of early days back in 2006. In China, there were cases of mass mortality. More than 6,000 waterfowls were dead. So, as shown, among the wild birds, the natural host, the highly pathogenic avian influenza virus spread, and this has triggered the global spread. So the ducks, which are natural host, and also the shorebirds, the infection spread at the moment among many wild birds. The avian influenza virus has spread. Among researchers, it was feared by the researchers, but among ducks and shorebirds, where they live in Siberia, the virus might take root among different kinds of ducks and shorebirds. And with the virus going in that location, the new mutation of genes can take place, or the gene types can be gathered and would give rise to new viruses and can be spread to the rest of the world. So that was feared among researchers, and that seems to have become a reality. For instance, in Europe, or what was separated in Europe, the virus type there was in the following year, the same genotype virus was detected. That's already become a reality. One other point where this virus is very important in terms of public health and or animal health is that among the wild birds, this is spreading among the rare species of the birds, and because of that, the highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, this has led to a new problem of environmental issue, which is relevant to biodiversity, in addition to this being public health and animal health concern. Now, among the wild birds, This is based on data up to 2018 in Japan. So far, among 324 different bodies of 27 kinds were detected. This is data from 2008 to 2018. So including this year, as you probably heard on the news, there are more infections in Kyushu, in Izumi, where cranes would come. The virus invaded, and highly pathogenic avian influenza virus has been separated. So H1N5, H1N5 and 6, 3 types of virus. H5N1, H5N8, and H5N6 have been detected, 3 types, but so far H5N2, which was not detected or separated in the past, is now detected. These include a rare bird species as well, and as was introduced earlier, they are new aspects of highly pathogenic avian influenza, how that should be treated as an environmental issue, and that's detected or observed in Japan as well.
昨年の例
So this is an example from last year. One of the example of how the influenza spread. This is on a white-tailed seagull from Hokkaido area. Actually, this was the very first case where we saw an infection among white-tailed seagull. Like falcons, cranes, there are such cases, but lately we are seeing more wider spread among rare birds, and that's becoming more typical. And also, the crows, a lot more crows are infected, and that's one of the typical characteristics that we are seeing lately. Now, the National Institute is looking at 3 different monitoring, having 3 different monitorings. One is feces of ducks, and a swab of dead wild birds, and also the swab of captured live wild birds. And so we are monitoring them. The first 2, that's under the Ministry of Environment, and it's a part of the avian influenza status of the Ministry of Environment. This is the trend of avian influenza virus positivity rates over the last 10 years. So we have 3 different seasons, one for ducks, when the ducks actually start flying to Japan, and then during the winter, and in the spring when they start leaving back to Siberia. And so this is for the feces of ducks. And as you can see, at the initial stage, there is a high positivity, and that happens every year. So when they fly in early autumn, that's when we really do need to have very deep studies and widespread studies. And we are also looking at the area that has a higher positivity. So this map actually shows areas with high positivity. Mid-Japan toward the Kyushu area. They start spreading in the early fall. That's a trend. And you think the influenza, avian influenza, you might think it starts in northern area, but it's not the case. The western area is where we start initial spread. And what kind of birds bring virus to Japan? So we looked at positive, birds that turned out to be positive. And if you look at pheasants, the most common one are mallard ducks. And we are looking at mitochondria DNA. So we are looking at the sequence of the DNA. And these two birds, mallards and ducks, and we are not able to separate the two. That's why those two birds are actually put together in one category. And we are now able to separate these two. And according to that, we thought mallard were the one that really brought virus. So we thought most of the blue portion was originating from mallard. But according to our study, seems like ducks are also widely positive. So we do also need to study ducks further. And also for the shorebirds, actually we do not have many cases of positive. And we looked at 2,000 or so birds. And there is only one case that we found. And it was not highly pathogenic, but we did find one positive case among the meadowpeas plover. And we also learned there are larger number of positive cases among colors and temeritis. And so we do need to take a closer look at these two kinds. Up until now, when we studied ducks, in the past, there was one blind spot or weak spot because we always had to use chicken eggs to cultivate virus, and the positivity was recognized only after like 10 days of so after it's being cultivated, or it's been cultured, cultured by using chicken eggs. But in half of the case, while there is a positivity in genes, we were not able to culture the virus in egg. So half of the positive case, we could not culture the virus. But now we are looking at the gene analysis. We are analyzing genes using swabs. And with more effective use, instead of using egg chicken, we could actually extract RNA. So it took about 10 days before we could learn about subtypes of virus using egg culture. But now, with using RNA sequencing, we are able to find it out in about 3 days. And as I said, only half of the cases were successful in culturing, but now we have much higher successful cases. Probably some of you are wondering the influenza, the time they took to announce the avian influenza is much shorter. Some of you may have noticed that, and that's because of this. Now we have new method. The Ministry of Environment is now applying or deploying the technique that we have developed. So I'm not going to go into the details, but it's quite effective and efficient. it's not that we have new technique. It's just a mixture or combination of existing techniques. Now, these are the samples where we are not able to successfully spread virus cases. Now we were able to successfully find which RNA. We are able to successfully extract all RNA samples. And we are also looking at risks. So this is the area with the positive cases of avian influenza. And by looking at different data and combining them, now we have risk map. And especially now we are looking at risk map against rare birds. So we have risk map for different rare species, especially falcons. They have higher risks compared to others. And the red spots is where we have risks. And if you look at this year's case, we do have more cases of infected falcons.
So this has to do with the host factors on the part of the hosts. But if by integrating the distribution of the infectious or cases of infection, we can also have an understanding of the infection for rare birds. And this can be applied to the risk assessment of highly pathogenic avian influenza. We are in the process of creating a new risk map. And what we published was avian flu as a whole and the risk assessment associated with that. But this is a risk map that is specialized in highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. As I mentioned earlier, we are developing the technique to detect more accurately, but another factor we consider important is the impact on the rare bird species. So that's something that we are doing more research on. In the case of wild birds or in the case of rare bird species, the virus will be infected, or it is impossible to infect the wild birds to see the impact. So we can't capture the golden eagle, 10 of a golden eagle for this infection experiment. That's not possible. So at the cell level, we try to assess the pathogenicity. So we have made an attempt to do that. So I'd like to go over that. So highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. The meaning of highly pathogenic is that it is the virus that would cause high mortality among chicken. That's why it is characterized as highly pathogenic. So depending on the bird, some bird species do not show any symptoms. Pigeons are one good example. They don't infect easily, and within the chicken's body, the virus doesn't increase, so it has resistance to the virus. On the other hand, when it comes to the swans, it shows higher mortality, and among the crows, there are some cases that lead to mortality, and there are other cases where it won't. Within the virus, depending on the virus, the results can be different. So depending on the bird species, the pathogenicity is different. But what about rare bird species? So we try to see if we can assess the pathogenicity by using cultured cells. What serves as the basis is at the Institute for Environmental Studies, we have the project to freeze the cells of rare bird species throughout the country. So rare birds and rare animals, specimen cells are collected and the cells are cultured and are frozen. So what was frozen and saved, we utilized those cells. And what we paid attention to was what's called MX protein. This would inhibit the increase of the virus. So we did an analysis based on that. So the increase and decrease of the virus, we paid attention to that to assess, because if you are to do the infection experiment among the rats that do not, where the MX protein or gene is not functioning, then the mortality is high. So we've focused on MX gene, and the expression of that was taken as an indicator to determine the pathogenicity. So we have a group of birds where there's a high mortality rate, and then there is a group of birds where it is detected, high mortality is detected among the wild birds with the cases of death, and then those birds that are taken care of under human beings. Those three groups have been looked at, and this is the gene expression. And among the rock pigeon, where it is said that it has high resistance over time, the expression goes up as the time goes by.
So as for chicken, actually expression has been suppressed. There is no reaction really. So I know it's not easy to understand how this is described. But in the case of rock pigeon, it's like 100 times the original. So it actually express very rapidly. But in the case of chicken, maybe even if there is some expression, there's maybe 10 times. That's not at the most. And so these are the different raptors. Among the raptors, we don't see a lot of expression. So that it did not actually increase as much. So falcons, why you can see the expression of is much lower, and for hooded crane and white-napped cranes, there are more expressions. So among the rare animals, the ones that are breeded, and if there is infection within a facility, there could be a huge impact. That's why we are looking at the ones that we are breeding. So golden eagles, we do not see hyperexpression. But on the other hand, the storks and red-crowned cranes, we do see higher level of expression. And especially the Okinawa rails, there is hardly any expressions, gene expressions, and that's a very important result. So Okinawa rails, while we are breeding in captivation, we do need to work on issues. We need to actually have some sort of resolution against any infection. So in summary, There are some birds that are similar to rock birds. There are some that are similar to chicken in terms of expression of genes. So there are largely two categories, very clearly separated. But at the cell level, you can actually learn about the pathology. And now, the cranes, there are a lot of epidemics and infections. This is a case from Israel, where we saw mass death among the cranes. And we are hoping that it won't happen in Izmir, because there is a large number of infections that's being observed. So we do need to look at it closely.
This is my last slide. So avian influenza virus is a public health and the animal health issue. In addition to that, among the rare bird species, or it is infecting rare bird species and other wild birds, so it is a threat to biodiversity. So not just from medical perspective, this should also be seen as having an aspect in terms of the environmental impact. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Onuma. Next presenter is not present at this venue. He will be participating online from Hawaii. And that is from Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, Associate Research Professor Eric Franklin. Can you hear me?
Hear me?
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Excellent. My name is Eric Franklin. I am from the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology at the University of Hawaii. I also am in the Department of Geography and Environment. A lot of the work I'll share with you today is done with some colleagues in that group. Very honored to present today, and I appreciate the invitation. Thank you. So we're emerging from the global coronavirus pandemic. This is the worst pandemic we've experienced in 100 years. Some of the just updated summaries of its impact are over 6.5 million human deaths, 630 million total cases, and recently approximately 27,000 cases. And I'm sure most of us probably would expect that these are actually underestimates of the impacts. And from an economic perspective, the event led to a shrinkage of the global GDP of an estimate of $22 trillion US. And so in the midst of the pandemic, I am a professor at the University of Hawaii, and one of the activities I'm involved in is actually collaborating on running a course to teach graduate and undergraduate students basically how to perform research. And this was initiated by a colleague of mine, Camila Mora, and together we've participated in a number of these classes. And they typically start with a brainstorming session that is trying to identify what is a unanswered global climate change question. And during the spring of 2020, our course came up with what are the effects of climate change on human pathogenic diseases. And I'll use the word pathogenic or infectious synonymously here. So if I flip back and forth, it's the same thing. And so during this course, once we've identified what the purpose of our study is going to be, we'll review the existing literature, synthesize that available information, and write a paper to address that question. And part of the usefulness of doing it at a course setting is you've got this kind of, all the labor. You've got many students that are willing and able to participate in something that as an individual researcher, you wouldn't be able to do just because there's such a volume of information to comb through. And so, jumping to the punchline, what I'll present on today is some of our work that was published in Nature Climate Change. Over half of known human pathogenic diseases can be aggravated by climate change, and this was put out in August 2022. And so one of the first steps that we did, and this was building on some of our prior work, is just looking at what are the climate hazards that are influenced by global warming or greenhouse gas emissions. And the upper figure here just demonstrates the linkages between emissions leading to things like warming, influencing the oceans and ocean climate change, influencing storms and sea level, evaporation and precipitation and drought, also having a relationship with floods, heat waves and fires. And this is just one example of how you can piece these together. There are other ways to exhibit these relationships from greenhouse gas emissions. But the key here is that I want you to just realize that we're looking at these, what we're calling these 10 major climate hazards. So warming, drought, heat waves, fires or wildfires, floods, precipitation, so that can be rain, natural cover change, so land cover changing, storms, sea level rise, and ocean climate change. And that can be ocean chemistry and warming. And so the steps that we take in the class are first, for this particular question, we needed to generate an authoritative list of human pathogenic diseases. Surprisingly, that wasn't available in one place. We thought there would be an existing text or an existing web resource that would have an authoritative list. So we didn't find that. So what we ended up doing is working with two primary sources, one from the US Center for Disease Control, and the other from a group called Gideon. This is the Global Infectious Disease and Epidemiology Network. They both maintained lists. There was significant overlap, but surprisingly, there was some gaps there that one resource didn't have some of the diseases that the other did. So we ended up merging these to create an authoritative list. And then we went through a process, which I'll go into a bit more detail about, but we wanted to identify and review papers that had all of these diseases with each of these climate hazards, finding any relationships. And our literature review ended up including over 77,000 titles. So quite an extensive review of the existing literature. And as a guiding criteria for trying to find papers that were relevant to our study, we looked at things that had an explicit climate hazard that claimed to have an effect on an explicit disease in an implicit place and time. And there's some detail here that I'll walk through. So the three tables in this figure represent the steps that we took in our search. So the first keyword matrix was a combination of each disease, the word disease with our climate hazards, where we're finding 200 references that came up that were using Google search, Google Scholar for these searches. And so for each of these 200 first references that came up, we would generate over 2,000 references to comb through. And often we found that a lot of these were reviews. And so we would use those to then identify other sources that we could include in the study. And then our second search was taking each individual disease with each individual hazard and identifying the top 20 references that came out. And that led us to review, it says 75,000, but it was a bit over 75,000 references. And so, that 20 references seems like a short list, but a lot was encompassed in there because what we're trying to identify is just the presence of some publications that intersect this particular disease with a particular climate hazard. And then for our last search, we were checking data gaps. So in the search, the first and second search, if we didn't have a particular disease and a particular climate hazard with any results, then we would use different search terminology for either disease or the climate hazard, just to try and identify any particular papers that would come up as some evidence that there may be a linkage between those. And there were some there were existing data gaps. But this was our comprehensive way to try to identify, are there climate hazard linkages with these existing disease lists? And I won't call the list comprehensive, we'll call it authoritative. But we feel it's fairly representative of the known list of human infectious diseases. And so this is a summary in the form of a Sankey plot of what we found from our search, our literature search. On the very left, that column are climate hazards. So those are our 10 climate hazards: warming, precipitation, floods, drought, storms, natural cover change, ocean climate change, fires, heat waves, and sea level. And the height of those, each of those hazards, the height of the little bar represents how many examples that we found from the literature in our search. And then we also looked at describing the transmission pathway from the climate hazard through to the disease. And the transmission pathways we identified were vector-borne, waterborne, airborne, direct contact, foodborne, and then unspecified, as there were a number of studies that did not explicitly specify what that transmission pathway was, but still had a disease linkage. And then the diseases for this figure, we've categorized in these broad groups. So viruses, bacteria, animals, fungi, protozoans, plants, chromis, and then unspecified. And these are diseases that were somewhat generally described or were a little vague. So it could be gastrointestinal infection or eye infection. And so we categorize these as unspecified. And from our search, we found over 3,200 papers met that criteria that I described. And from those, we identified over 1,000 unique climate hazard to transmission pathway to disease combinations. And these are represented in these gray lines in the Sankey plot. And in a little bit, I'll show you an interactive form of this that has even more detail that's open on the web that folks can use to learn more about our results. And just generally, what we found were some of the most common papers were from the climate hazard of warming, leading to a vector-borne virus. Also, we found that floods led to waterborne bacteria. And if you're familiar with infectious diseases, these results shouldn't be a surprise to you. And so the general conclusions from the paper is that we found 58% of infectious diseases confronted by humanity worldwide have at some point been aggravated by climate hazards. And note, I'm not necessarily saying climate change here. We're just identifying climate hazards that we know greenhouse gas emissions have an impact on, but not necessarily that these prior publications were suggesting that it was a climate change driven event. But we are then presenting this as these future events will increase due to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and thus the climate hazards that drive these infectious diseases will also increase. We also found that 16% of diseases were at times diminished, so meaning they were not as bad, they got better. But only 9 of these diseases were exclusively diminished, and the rest of them were both in some cases diminished and in some cases aggravated. And so it's quite rare that climate hazards that climate hazards that are influenced by climate change led to these diseases getting less bad, really. We did find some general conclusions from our search. One of them is that climate hazards bring pathogens closer to people. And so some examples of how this would happen are precipitation and warming can lead to a range expansion for vectors, where they're moving into habitats that they haven't previously been because warming is now moving into, say, higher latitudes. And we found, I think, some good examples presented earlier in the talks for this session of that. We also found that climate hazards bring people closer to pathogens. And for example, human migration following a climate disaster may expose people to novel vectors and pathogens that they didn't have where they're coming from. Another of our conclusions is that pathogens were strengthened by climate hazards. An example is that warming led to an enhanced transmission of West Nile virus from mosquito vectors. And finally, we also found that people were impaired by climate hazards. And this can happen when conditions, a good recent example of this is conditions after the severe flooding in Pakistan leave people more susceptible to diseases. And again, that floods are linked to waterborne bacterial diseases. And so you'll see an increase in these events. Another example is some of the recent hurricanes hitting Florida. After the fact, you're seeing standing water and flooding and diseases impacting folks after the initial storm has passed. And so on a prior slide, I showed you the Sankey plot, which is a nice summary of our findings, but I'd also like to now switch over to share with you another resource. So we built an online tool that summarizes all of the work from the literature survey. And so it's structured similarly to the Sankey plot, where on the left we have the climate hazards. And as you see, as I roll over them, hopefully you're seeing this where you are, as I roll over them, the linkages, so the lines drawn between the climate hazard transmission type and disease and pathogen will light up. That gives you an example of where these connections actually are, because there's so many lines that can be difficult to see. So we're going over heat waves, now natural cover change, ocean climate change, precipitation. And again, much like the Sankey plot that I showed earlier, the height of these bars represents the number of examples in our database. And so I'll just scroll down a bit to warming. Warming was our highest result, and you can see there's a number of connections. One going directly here to mosquitoes, and then we've got some species of mosquitoes, and these are all under the vector-borne examples. And there's quite a lot here, so I'll just scroll down a bit. We also remember I said that we identified waterborne. And so you can look at drinking water or contact. Also look at foodborne and airborne and direct contact. And you can identify, let's say direct contact is, touching, and that will highlight where those connections are and what diseases and pathogens they go to. So I'll scroll back up and come to the disease pathogen side, where we have an area here that's unspecified. And remember, I talked about that in our initial summary, but you can also go directly to bacteria and look at, say, cholera, and that will show you the linkage back to the climate hazard and the transmission type. There's also listings for viral pathogens. So here's dengue, for example. And then we have a number of others, so fungal, protozoan, animalia, broken down in a few groups. And so this is just the highest level of this tool. So I'll scroll back up to the top. And let's say you are interested specifically in mosquitoes. So I'm going to click that. And now the node is just subset to everything that's related to mosquitoes. And so we can see now that we found in our literature search some explicit relationship between drought, fires, floods, heat waves, natural cover change, ocean climate change, precipitation, sea level, storms, and warming, all with just that mosquito vector. And they're related to all of these disease pathogens. So if we're interested in, say, dengue, we can click that even further and go all the way down into, what are the climate hazards? What mosquitoes what mosquito species have been identified for the dengue virus? And if I click on that, that now will go actually to all of the entries. So these are the papers that are summarized, where we've got a source, we've got what that type of climatic change was, what the pathogen was, and what the transmission type was. And then what was the impact? Remember, I said there were both negative and very few positive impacts, but this will let you know whether it was a negative or positive. And this tells you what the actual, we're pulling the language out of the paper for what we found. And then which of the co-authors here that was involved entered that. And so we've turned, it says download, but unfortunately we've turned that off because we can't share a lot of these papers directly for copyright issues. But I won't go down the list here, but just gives you an idea. I'm scrolling through, and these are all papers that make up this relationship of the mosquito and dengue that we found from our literature search. And I'll scroll back here to the top to close this window. And so you can just go right back, and I'm just going to go back to our highest level. And you can create these searches in any way that you want, meaning that you can click on kind of any of these. I think an earlier, let's see. So say an earlier talk was ticks. Will I be able to find ticks? Ticks. Here we go. So here's ticks. If you're interested in relationships between climate hazards and ticks, you can just bring this up. There's now a list of the species that we found and all of the disease types that are related to ticks. And so this tool is something that we hope that practitioners and even the general public interested in our findings, they would have direct access to be able to utilize it. It's hosted on one of my collaborators' GitHub page. It's open access and completely shared with the world for anyone that wants to utilize it. And I will go back to my PowerPoint now. Okay. One of the purposes that we have for these levels of papers, it was published in Nature Climate Change, which is a fairly high impact paper. But if you're not familiar with altmetrics are a way for you to gauge how much online and news viewership that your scientific publication has had. And so we've had, this is actually an older slide, we've had quite a bit of just kind of news and social media coverage. We want to get the word out about this. We want people to be aware of both the impacts as well as that there's this resource that they can utilize for their own work or increasing their information about the topic. But this also gives you an idea of how much coverage your paper has had relative to other papers. So for example, given papers of similar age in Nature Climate Change, this was the #1 covered paper in the journal. And I believe even from the journal itself, we had over 60,000 downloads within the first week for this paper. So fortunately, this work is getting out, and my talk today is another example. We really want to increase knowledge about about this work. So I, again, appreciate the invitation. And one of the things that we didn't cover in this particular paper, but I'm sharing now a figure from a prior paper that we did, which we've kind of built this idea of for the infectious diseases off of the climate hazards. We've geographically mapped all of these environmental climate hazards, and we've looked at them as, you know, relative to a 1950s baseline, are they going to increase or decrease? And so at least for this slide, anything red geographically is going to have an increase for droughts or fires, floods, heat waves, and et cetera. This list of these major climate hazards that we've talked about. And so one possible future project that we're looking into is this idea of combining the infectious disease database with some of our environmental, spatially explicit environmental predictive work to then couple, you know, where do we expect some of these things to happen? That sort of analysis is a lot more in depth. And I think there was a great example earlier that presented on the predictive risk maps for the avian flu. So it's similar work to that to try and understand spatially and temporally where might some of these risks occur or emerge. And these are a set of tools that would allow you to do that, at least at a global scale. And so I'm on time, thankfully. I'll say mahalo, that's in Hawaiian, thank you. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators, Camila Mora, Tristan McKenzie, Izzy Gaw, Jackie Dean, Hannah von Hammerstein, Tabby Knudsen, Renee Setter, Charlotte Smith, Kira Webster, and John Patz. And this is the citation for the paper in Nature Climate Change, as well as the URL or the web address for the online tool that I showed you if you're interested in using that or learning more. And if you'd like to follow up with me, here's my contact email. And here is a picture of the lovely place I get to ride a boat out to work every day. So again, I'm honored to be able to present to you today. And thank you so much for listening to my work.
Franklin 先生、ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Professor Franklin. We ended the presentations a bit earlier than scheduled, so let me ask one question to Dr. Franklin. So with this research, so here's the question. With this research, is there anything that was found regarding climate change and diseases? In other words, is there a spillover or the emergence of emerging infectious diseases? Are they also impacted by the climate change?
One of the challenges of trying to predict where things will occur is, you know, for this study, we're just looking at prior work. But the COVID pandemic has shown us that the emergence of new pathogens is to be expected. And I think it would be challenging to accurately predict where they may occur. I think, again, the example earlier of the avian flu risk map is a great step towards being able to geographically show what are areas that may be at risk. And so to be able to do that, you would have to have more information than what we presented in this current study. So especially if it's things like vector-borne diseases, we would also have to incorporate what is the range of these different vectors, how do they respond to these climate hazards, and then spatially map the geospatial and temporal relationship between their current range and where they may then expand. And you can overlap that with things like human population density and try and then start to predict where are these areas that a new occurrence or a spillover may happen. But at least what we've presented is kind of looking backwards to see what is that relationship between hazards and infectious diseases to try and inform how things in the future, may look with climate change.
はい、ありがとうございました。では、ディスカッション。
Thank you very much. Now we would like to go into a discussion. So I'd like to invite the presenters to come up to the stage.
ディスカッションは30分の
So we have about 30 minutes of discussion, and that is to be followed by questions to be taken from the floor. So as you listen to the discussion, if you think of any, could you think of your questions to those of you who are in the audience?
Mm. はい、ではディスカッションを開始したいと思います。
So we'd like to start the discussion. So first, well, we have four presenters. So from the presentations made by the four presenters, we understand that the emerging infectious diseases is a huge issue, and for humankind to is causing a lot of things that gave rise to these emerging infectious diseases. It just so happened that I had an opportunity to attend the Cosmos Prize, and Professor Keating in the US in terms of biodiversity and emerging infectious diseases, the relationship between the two. In other words, in the ecosystem where it is highly biologically diverse, it is less likely to find the diseases. So that professor received this award. So in that context, I'd like to ask about the practical countermeasures to reduce the pandemic risk.
五箇先生の方は多様ないろんな疾病の話をされたそのダニの問題も。
Of course, including ticks and mites, but there are some foreign diseases and so on. And on the other hand, Dr. Onuma talked about one typical disease, which is avian influenza. So the differences between the two, there is a possibility of spillover to human society and the pandemic potential. What is the characteristic for the avian influenza to really spill over and start spreading among humans? And is there a difference from other types of epidemics? Dr. Onuma, please start. So regarding avian influenza, so it's very unlikely that it would be, at this point, we are not seeing any variants where it would spill over to human, especially for the highly pathogenic flu. It's not going to spill over to human society, not at this point in any way, not the way that we see with COVID. But if you consider other viruses that consider the pandemics, RNA viruses for the respiratory system, that's typical. So highly pathogenic virus also has the same characteristic. So we have to monitor it closely, because there is a potential that that virus has a potential of spillover to humankind. That's everything for myself. How about Dr. Goka? Well, as for the avian influenza, as Dr. Onuma mentioned, at this point we are not too concerned because it is specifically for birds at this point. However, by Spanish flu the research that came from avian influenza, and it actually evolved into new types of flu that really caused a huge pandemic among people. So we are really not, it's a virus. We don't know how it changes and what triggers that change. And the bunch of RNA, they don't really have policy or anything. They don't have cells that we have. So the way that it evolves is very different from other type of living things. So we don't know. There is a lot of unknown with viruses. So that's something that we have to be aware of. So now we know the birds that migrating birds are the ones that carries flu viruses. But there are captive foes like chickens and other type of birds that are with our household. But because in order to really raise the efficiency we need, the chickens are actually raised in a very condensed manner. And so by having a chicken in a very small condensed place, there is an environment ready to trigger the change. Once the trigger actually starts, there would be an epidemic. So that sort of environment is there. That's something we have to be aware of. And so actually out of the stocks that we have, and there is a closer contact between stocks and wildlife. And because humans are actually now our living sphere is actually invading wildlife, our living sphere. So there is more chance of transmission among wild animal and stocks we have. And that could actually cause a spillover to human society as well. So it's not just for avian influenza, but the way that we live, the way we behave, actually has an impact. And we have to control the way we work. So for now, we think it's an avian disease. And people actually look at it as an impact on the efficiency and production of chicken and so on, but it might actually cause a more serious situation among humans as a disease. Well, regarding avian influenza, is there other way of carrying, like Dr. Franklin mentioned, how can it spread? How can it be, could it become a serious pandemic? Can you actually talk about that? Well, regarding prediction on what could happen, the risks that we have, among the existing viruses, what would cause an extent pandemic? There is a lot of work on that, and there is a lot of concern. And we have a huge database that we are trying to analyze. But the virus evolves in a very different ways. And you know, the monkeypox, it's an epidemic. It was an epidemic in Africa, but now once it reached the European continent, it started spreading a lot faster. So in terms of forecasting what could happen, climate change is a concern, forest destruction is a concern, the way we contact with wildlife is a concern, because climate change is causing breeding sites of animals to change, and humans way that where we live, our habitat is also changing, and those changes are taking place very rapidly. So the spillover of new virus, there could be a hotspot in different places. the way the global supply chain is changing, the countries are developing faster. So it's not just medical studies, but there is social and economical changes that could cause different pandemic to start in different places. So it's very difficult to forecast. Media is always also question us. But the fact that it is a black box and the fact that we cannot really predict that well is something that we have to be aware of. The Earth is changing very rapidly, and some of the disease that we thought had ceased may come back, and even in the mites and right, there's some of the diseases that was really fearful and that's considered diseased and old and outdated. Now it's coming back. So, we have to be aware of that as well. So the difficulty of prediction is something we have to be aware of. I see. Thank you. Well, Dr. Watanabe, I have a question for you. Dr. Goka just mentioned about, talked about cohabitants, the way our society is. So it goes beyond just the medicine. When you think about planetary health, when you consider that planetary health, you will have a vital role in that. So yeah, it is a difficult topic to address. But the infrastructure of the society, that's something that has an impact on everything we talked about today. The infections from livestock, the way we breed, and of course AMR is a concern, all the antibiotic that we use. There is a lot of resistant substances. So, those AMR could actually cause another set of epidemics and pandemics. So the way we are approaching that, the way we have livestock and the way we have all the AMR use, those are the things that we have to look into. The way we are working right now may actually cause future problems. So we have to constantly consider what we are doing and how we are going about it and what could be the result. And zoning, how we can separate the habitat for human and wildlife. I think we should have some kind of loose boundaries between the two. And the planetary health, the concept of planetary health, I think humans are too egoistic. We are too concerned about humans' welfare. And we really kind of lost the track of what is happening to non-human living things on this planet. Our lives are supported by the very nature and by the other living things. But we are only looking at it from our own perspective. And that's something we have to change. And how can we go about it is a big question that we have to ask. We might have an eco tour to learn more about the forest, but I think there are a lot of negative impact from our activities. So I think it's very important to become aware of how we interfere with other animals, other living things, viruses in society, nature and so on. That's something you have to look at.
Thank you for your opinion. As for the avian flu, symbiosis in the local community and how humans coexist with the nature. And in case of avian flu, the humans and avian flu coexistence. How do you address this, Dr. Onuma? Humankind and symbiosis with avian flu? Well, in a way, avian flu has been for a long time with humans. They are around us. They have been with us from time to time. That's the nature of the avian flu virus. They transmit to humans or not. Well, depends on the other environmental factors such as poultry, chicken farm, and so on. Symbiosis? That's a difficult question to answer. Can we live together? Well, we have been, in fact, together with them, whether we like it or not. We are with them. They are around them. So, infectious virus mutation to humans has to be prevented. There's something we can do, perhaps. For example, chickens vaccination is one way. Some people argue it could be an effective way. Perhaps virus may mutate more easily and may be more infectious to humans. That's a risk of vaccination to chickens. So, what measures are we going to take? What activities or behavior change we're going to take will alter the course of future. Can we act in union throughout the world? Maybe not. Then what is a better way for us? What's the better measures for humankind to take? But that is a very difficult discussion. Vaccination intention differs from one country to the other. Some loves to vaccinate and some don't, and so on. But that has something to do with the virus, susceptibility to mutation, and we have to have a global consensus on this issue. We coexist with the virus, but we hope they are distant from transmission to humans, I hope. That's how we would live with pathogenic viruses like avian flu. Well, symbiosis is a difficult word. Pandemic, we are forced to live together with them, yeah, in a way. But when we say symbiosis, that's a balanced environment and less hazards to humans. That's the assumption for symbiosis when we use the term. Dr. Franklin, question to you. In your literature search, avian flu and associated diseases, did you get any new information or findings out of your research?
Specifically for avian flu, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you if there's anything new. Honestly, we discovered so many pathogens and diseases. We didn't necessarily key in on any one particular disease, but it's something that after the call, we all can go look in our tool and see what was discovered. But I think for the database, to me, the most shocking conclusion is that the majority of pathogenic diseases are negatively impacted by climate change, meaning they will get worse. And if there are some conclusions from that, it's we need to, in any way possible, decrease greenhouse gas emissions. And COP27 currently is grappling with how to do that. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the kind of global cooperation necessary to actually make substantive change in that direction to meet those goals. But I would say our key finding is just that we need to try and head off some of these negative impacts, because when you're talking about the majority of human pathogenic diseases being influenced, you can imagine the necessary response from the human health systems to try and both handle these increases and I won't even say predict, because predicting emerging diseases is, as my colleagues have said on the panel, extremely difficult. And it's not that we're not trying, it's just that there's so many variables and uncertainty that go into that process. But the other component, I would say, excuse me, is to try and maintain and even enhance our early warning system for emerging diseases. I think that is going to be, one of our best, tools to try and avert another global pandemic, is at least being able to identify it and try and at least stop it before it spreads quickly, which is an extremely difficult challenge in our current world, where anyone can hop on a plane and be around the world in the same day. So not to shirk the question about avian flu, but there wasn't anything that stuck with me, but it's definitely something that interested researchers could look in the database and see what we found, and compare it to their own knowledge to see if there is something novel there.
ありがとうございました。今の最後のところは
Thank you very much. The last part of the statement, the early discovery, signal detection, as Dr. Goka mentioned, this should be better understood. Dr. Goka, please. Yes, like I said, viruses themselves are unpredictable indeed. So to put it the other way around, if we're going to get the signals detected early, then we may contain them early. So how not to mutate them to the humanized ones, pathogens? Well, because cause of the evolution cannot prevent us from them to getting into a humanized way, but contaminated, another measure we can have. The COVID-19 taught us a lot of lessons. The global people traffic is so rapid and voluminous. That's why it's global pandemic now. In such a short time, if this was 100 years ago, the virus do not travel that fast to that many, and it was contained as simply as an emetic, and being in the modern medicine, they have to do everything to rescue every single person possible. That's why the medical system is on the course of collapse and so on. No matter what, how downward spiral the economy went, they try to prevent the pandemic and so on. That was the basic philosophy of the human society. So not simply to the global community interdependence, but we should have an autonomous structure to sustain ourselves to a certain extent. Early detection and early containment is quite important. That should be the mechanism we should have in our society. Environmental mechanism must be there. That's what COVID taught. Dr. Watanabe, please. Dr. Goka said it right. I agree with him. Well, when it comes, we have to shift modality of our community. You see, locally based system to all the way through. That's not sustainable, right from the beginning to the end. So we have to switch and shift modality to cope with the situation. I know it's easier to say and difficult to be done, but we cannot simply always go for the global mode. In terms of disease transmission, global is not something with a negative, and because of environmental burden and so on. So one society or community may have several modalities to operate on. I know it's difficult to do, but we have to think differently from now on, I have to say. And in addition to that, 14th century, the typhoid, the plague hit Europe. 1/3 or 1/4 of the European people perished, the record shows. And at that time, the Black Sea to Asia, I think that was the origin. It started with the Black Sea down to England, 2 years it traveled. And Dr. Goka said it's easily to be traveled like in a way or two. that the COVID traveled across the world. So that's the speed nowadays. And the speed changed in terms of human society. And we cannot rely solely on the current one, but we cannot fix everything down to the locally based. So we have to strike a better balance. Thank you.
Professor Onuma, do you have anything you'd like to add to the point that was just raised? You mean the current point that was raised? Well, from early detection and warning, whether we should be able to do something about it. Well, early detection, in the case of avian flu, specifically about that, early detection from that perspective, what is done mainly by Ministry of the Environment, the survey on the virus being held at different species of animals, I think that can be one effective way. Also, by introducing a new method, different varieties of viruses sequence information can be obtained now. So what kind of mutation took place, it's easier to detect on that rather than how it was in the past, at least among the wild bird species, how the virus is spreading compared to how it was in the past. We can get a lot more information now. So on that point, in this session, well, starting yesterday, One Health is the theme of this academic conference, and One Health is human, pathogen, and animal, how to position those three in the environment. That's the rough concept behind One Health. And surveillance and monitoring, both in terms of human diseases and animal diseases, those would be taken as one. And there's that concept behind this word One Health. But in terms of a concept, planetary health is something that was introduced later. But are there any fundamental differences between the two, Professor Watanabe? Well, planetary health and One Health, I think in terms of a direction to go into, I don't think there's much difference between the two. In one of my slides, there was one slide that has that had the table, and if I were to point out one difference, One Health focuses more on infectious diseases, whereas planetary health focuses more broadly, like with the heat wave leading to death or the increased risk of the existing diseases. Those are also considered important. That may be the difference between the two concepts, perhaps. I see. So this is a question to Professor Goka. In the afternoon yesterday, there were various presentations made, and for One Health to be understood more widely and be more widely implemented, well, I got some sense of encouragement that it should be done in that direction. And as Japan, as a country, is there anything that we should do first, or is there anything that we should focus on first? Yes. Well, One Health from the perspective of biodiversity, I gave a talk on how to link between the two. So mainstreaming of One Health, before that, biodiversity mainstreaming, we are struggling with that even. And the Ministry of the Environment is focusing on that, but global warming is more widely known. Policy measures are being taken, and COP is now at 27. There's COP on biodiversity, but it's only at COP 15, so it is lagging behind clearly. In the case of global warming, the temperature rise and the CO2, which is emitted from industry, in a way, it is closer to home. I mean, you can see it more clearly, and it's easy to find out more about. To begin with, it involves money too in terms of emissions trading, so that will have an impact on the economy and therefore cannot be ignored. So the government and private sector companies are paying a lot of attention. On the other hand, in the case of biodiversity issue, it's not something that can readily feel. You could give an example of the particular type of shellfish in Ogasawara are going extinct. Not many people, butterfly kind going extinct, but it wasn't that widely reported. And then an extension of that is One Health. So biodiversity to human society, how important that is, and if that is to be degraded, then it would eventually have a huge impact on the human beings. That connection needs to be clearly explained, and that's the role that we as researchers will have to play, and the Ministry of the Environment is trying to show that as well. The biodiversity strategy only focuses on how living creatures are all important and should be cherished, but that's not the whole. That's not what this is about. It has a lot to do with the human society as a whole, and in that sense, the infectious diseases is a very interesting and important way to look at it. If you say that the COVID-19 has a root as the biodiversity issue, then it's maybe more widely and easily understood. So we have set up the research department on the biodiversity mainstreaming from infectious diseases issues. So it's One Health is really is about the importance, impact on the human society. I very much agree with that. Professor Watanabe, I forgot to mention about the difference between One Health and planetary health. I mentioned this in my presentation. When it comes to planetary health, the size of the Earth is considered important. We are living in a finite world, and One Health assumes that we are living, or all sorts of problems happen because we're living in a finite world. But when it comes to planetary health, the finiteness and the size of the Earth needs to be mindful of. That's emphasized a lot more. I think there's that perspective in One Health, but planetary health emphasizes more on that finiteness. That may be the difference. Understood. Thank you. We have about 20 minutes or so. So we have about 10 minutes. So I would like to invite the audience to raise questions. If you have a question, please proceed to where the microphone is. My name is Maeda from the Institute of Infectious Diseases. I'm working on zoonoses, and your initiative, especially with regards to One Health, I've always thought that those initiatives are very important. Now, in order to eliminate infectious diseases, there are various initiatives being taken. Sorry to focus just on infectious diseases, but it will take a long time before we start to see the results, or it may be very difficult to see the results of the initiatives taken. And then if that's the case, citizens and government administrations might lose a momentum. Because of COVID-19, there's a lot of heightened momentum, but going forward, in what ways we can continue with this momentum despite the fact that this is not necessarily a good thing in and of itself, but in order to protect the Earth, are there any indicators where we can see short-term and slightly long-term? If there were such metrics or indices, then it's easier to work on. We know that we have to do it, and we know roughly what outcome we can get, but there's no indicator or anything. So any thoughts on this? Any presenters? It would be helpful to have some kind of metric or indices. Well, it's infectious diseases issue, so perhaps Professor Goka should answer. Yes, I'm working closely with Mr. Maeda. So when it comes to metrics or indicators, this is very difficult to see for environmental issues as a whole. There's a lot of efforts being done for global warming, but after 100 years, we may be able to stop the rise of the temperature. So at the current point in time, it is very difficult to see the result. Likewise, with biodiversity, by changing the current lifestyle, we can slow the extinction of the species, but the species world or the animal world may be very distant to see. And also with COVID-19, we as researchers, we had a lot of expectations. Back when the Japan was struck with a huge earthquake back in March 11, 2011, we thought that there may be heightened attention and interest in the electric power generations, but it was closed as a localized issue, and after a while, people just went back to life as usual. With COVID-19, with the global pandemic, with the common sense of crisis, I thought, or we researchers thought, that this will be a good opportunity for everyone to change its lifestyle. But if you look at Japan, once the difficult times are over, seems like it's being forgotten. So as Professor Watanabe mentioned, we easily forget how we should, we are easy to forget, and we don't appreciate things that we take for granted. So that's the human nature. Sorry that I'm taking up a lot of time, but human beings have a lot of huge cerebral parts, and so we tend to pursue the maximization of happiness for the individual because we're living in a safe civilization. For other creatures, they want to leave their offsprings behind. They can't afford to enjoy leisure, and many of the animals don't have much retired life, as it were, whereas we human beings do. So there's this tendency to, or desire to enjoy life. So that seems to have been the root cause of the environmental issues. In other words, in order to satisfy one's desires and needs, we don't think about the impact for later generations. So this human nature, unless we can overcome this global warming issue, the infectious disease issue, these cannot be resolved. I may be being pessimistic, but there has to be something that would bring about a paradigm shift. And what that is, that's something that researchers are thinking about. I'm sorry I'm not offering any answer, but it's very difficult to overcome. Well, that's like a destiny for Homo sapiens, I guess. Onuma, Professor Onuma, anything?
鳥インフルエンザのに関連したことに
Avian influenza. You know, my discussion will be limited to that. But in 2008, I've been we are checking the status of positive status of the avian influenza, and it actually was a surprise to me. While we did not have any cases within Japan, the ministry decided to monitor it throughout this period. And regarding avian influenza, the Ministry of Labor and Health and Ministry of Environment, and there's another ministry involved. So they are actually looking at 3 ministries are working on this infectious disease, which is very unusual for Japanese administration. And actually, I've been involved with this research for about the last 10 years. About the monitoring of this disease. And I hope the same thing will happen in other infectious diseases. The same type of budgetary and effort are made toward that. And I hope that I can actually help. Dr. Maeda, I really would like to see you help us expand the scope to other types of infectious diseases. Okay, well, thank you so much. Dr. Watanabe, I know it takes a long time for the government to move, so I know that you are a forerunner in this, and so if you can really lead us, well, the planetary health is not really new. It's just a collaboration of different academics arena. And there are different research groups, and there is an evaluation toward planetary health. And if hopefully we may be able to come up with some sort of scoring or measurement system to learn about our efforts. I think it's important all the people are aware of the fact that this is a concern for all of us. And if people start expecting something to come out of an effort, then there will be a focal on promoting things. But most of people are probably just not aware. And while we are providing different forecasts, we know that there is certain uncertainty involved with forecasts and predictions. But we are still trying to do our best to predict what's going to happen and try to do something ahead of time in order to avoid certain things from happening. And, actually, you can actually expect immediate results, something that's going to take place in a year or so. But if it's few years away, it's very difficult. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, we saw a prophet, and we never really thought in 100 years there is be a climate concern that we have now. So, we just kind of try and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, we would stop and do something else. But we have to constantly think about what is going to take place in a long-term future. It's a very different way of what we are used to. And so we don't know, we have not learned how to deal with the long-term issue where the actual answer will come in years to come. So we're gonna have to learn how to deal with that. We're gonna have to really try to predict while we try. So we have. Is there anyone with a very short question, because we're running out of time? Yes, this is from WWF Japan. My name is Mitsuda. Thank you so much for the lecture. One thing, just a very. It's a big. Actually, it's a big question, not a small question. When we talk about biodiversity, in order to really stop zoonosis from happening. But when we think about biodiversity within Japan, we have to think about how to protect biodiversity within Japan. But we are heavily relied upon imports. That means we also depend on the biodiversity outside of Japan. And in order to understand that, as Dr. Franklin mentioned about, maybe there's a way to look at all of the measures and research results and try to monitor what is happening. And we do the same thing. And there is Living Planet report that came out in October, and it talks about biodiversity. We have Living Planet Index, and we announce it globally. But one concern with it is that there are since 1980s, we look at different papers. The publication, most of them are in English. It's not French, it's not Latin, but English, because it's easier to understand. So the publication tends to be English-based. That's one thing. The information is heavily in North America, Europe, Australia, and Japan. So the developed country has a large amount of information. However, to protect biodiversity, we have to look at Latin America, South America, and Africa, and Southeast Asia. And there are hotspots on a global basis. There are areas with a very rich biodiversity that we are not able to really gather effective data in. And so the developed countries and where the hotspots are not really matching. And it's very difficult to gather the appropriate data. There is a gap in data available and studies available. So if you have any thoughts on that, please give us an advice. Oh, that's a big question. Maybe just one or two people. Is there anyone who can actually volunteer on this question? Well, biodiversity, it's not just biodiversity, but there is a data gap on environmental issues. That's true. And there is a prediction model that allows us to project climate change. However, when we talked about the CO2, everything came out of Hawaii in the past. Now we have a global distribution, and the usage of satellite is one thing that really helped us. And we also have station posts to gather data in different parts of the world. It's not limited to developed countries, so that's true. And the CO2 condensation. Actually, CO2 is probably easier to monitor than biodiversity. So we just have to run a way to really look at the global, do the global monitoring. And also, citizen report is very important. We have citizens that reports various things using their smartphone apps. So that's something that we could use. And we could do that even with developing countries as well. And that could actually bring about more trusted and reliable data source. Yeah, biodiversity, as Dr. Watanabe mentioned, the data for environment, actually, it's been mainly done among the developed countries, because those are the countries that's working heavily on the publications as well. But if you got Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, there are a lot of so-called Western professionals that reside in those areas to try to study. So, ABS, access and beneficial, is a concern. So we should start really monitoring and delivering data from various parts of the world. And so developing skill sets needed locally is something that we have to be involved with. So that's something that biologists are aware of. And personally, I'm involved with foreign species, and we have to really have a strong pipe with the foreign countries in order to understand what is happening in other parts of the world. So, and I think that's an area that's going to probably progress. So WWF probably will be able to really help us with data mining and increase the visibility of the data on a global base. Is there anything else? Well, the Southeast Asia, I do have a lot of collaboration, and I do receive it. It is important that we have information from local area. The people in those areas, they are passionate about the studies and researches. And they hope that they will be able to start delivering information not from Japan, not through Japan, but from the local. And of course, it is heavily biased toward English as a language used, and it's a concern. And it's not an easy thing to solve in a short term, but I personally try to do my best. And thank you. Dr. Franklin, is there anything that you'd like to mention?
The panel has already said, and that the keys are partnerships with in-country scientists, leading to research and monitoring, but then also capacity building is a key, so that the scientist pool that's within a country is growing, their knowledge base is growing, their skill set is growing, and that you, in collaboration with them, can help build this bigger research enterprise. And then I think the last point is just the need for dedicated international funding. I have active collaborations in Southeast Asia and around the Western Pacific, and the national governments can provide some funds, but often it is quite limited. And so there has to be a concerted effort from the developed nations that are collaborating to continue to provide resources to fund these monitoring and scientific activities, I think, for them to be successful in the long run. The other thing I will say is, the planetary health perspective, at least in my experience, the message resonates better with the general public when you can still relate biodiversity or planetary goods and services to something that benefits the human. Unfortunately, we're very focused on ourselves, and I work a lot in marine systems, and so when I can talk about coral reefs as providing fisheries or coral reefs as providing shoreline protection, the value for then protecting and monitoring and doing research on that reef system resonates with the general populace, and they understand why it's important to do that. So I think even though there is value in biodiversity, just its own existence, I think unfortunately we often still have to bring the message back to how does biodiversity benefit humanity, and that is many different ways, but that seems to, at least in my own work, resonate quite well. So yeah, those are my comments. Thanks.
はい、ありがとうございました。これで10分近く伸びてしまいましたから、なかなか。
Sorry, we had a very good questions and we got a lot longer than expected, but thank you for your attention. I'd like to close the meeting for now. Thank you so much for the lecturers for wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is going to be the end of the subcommittee on environmental initiatives.